I thought my birthday surprise was a cake. But instead, my husband walked in holding a child's hand, followed by a woman I had never seen. Then he said 5 words that froze the room. "They re my family. From before you." I didn't he scream. I didn't he cry. I smiled and gave him a box he never expected. Pause. Let curiosity build. The morning of my birthday began like any other year, wrapped in small rituals that had quietly become tradition. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, warm and gentle, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe it would be an ordinary, happy day. My husband had already left the bed when I woke up, which was unusual. He was always the last one to rise, always teasing me for being an early bird. That morning, the house felt awake before I was, as if it had been holding its breath. By noon, the living room was dressed for celebration. Balloons floated near the ceiling. The dining table was set with my favorite plates, and a soft hum of voices drifted in from the kitchen where relatives gathered. Everyone smiled a little too deliberately, like actors rehearsing lines they weren't fully comfortable with. I noticed it, but I brushed it aside. Birthdays make people strange. I told myself, people get nervous trying to make things perfect. My husband stayed close, yet distant at the same time. He touched my shoulder when guests laughed, poured my drink before I asked, and checked his phone more than usual. Each time I caught his eyes, he smiled quickly, then looked away. Not the relaxed smile I knew after decades of marriage, but something tight, something rehearsed. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're carrying fragile glass and praying they don't drop it. As the afternoon stretched on, a sense of unease crept in quietly, like a draft through a closed window. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything felt misaligned. Conversations paused when I entered the room. My sister avoided my gaze. My husband's brother barely spoke to me at all. Even the music playing in the background felt too low, as if it were afraid to be heard. I remember thinking that the day felt less like a celebration and more like a stage set. Everyone had their places. Everyone knew their cues. Except me. Then my husband announced there was one more surprise. His voice cracked just slightly when he said it. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone dropped a fork. The room grew quiet in a way that felt heavy, expectant, almost solemn. I stood there smiling, cake crumbs on my plate, hands folded politely, unaware that the life I had lived for 30 years was about to split cleanly down the middle. When the doorbell rang, the sound cut through the room like a knife. And in that instant, before the door even opened, I knew this birthday was not about celebrating the past. It was about confronting it. He didn't ease into the truth. There was no careful explanation, no gentle framing to soften the blow. He simply stood up, walked toward the door, and opened it as if this moment had been waiting patiently for decades. When he stepped aside, a woman entered first. She looked composed, almost practiced in her calm, the kind of calm that comes from years of rehearsing a story in your head. Behind her was a young man, tall, uncertain, his eyes scanning the room as if he were trying to memorize faces that should have been familiar long ago. My husband cleared his throat and said their names. Then he said words that felt unreal, as though they belonged to someone else's life. He explained that before he met me, before our marriage, before everything I thought I knew. He had another life, a serious relationship, a child, not a mistake, not a brief lapse, a full family that continued quietly in the background while he built a different one with me. The room seemed to tilt as he spoke. 30 years. That was the number that echoed in my head. 30 years of birthdays, holidays, arguments, laughter, shared plans, and private promises, all layered on top of a secret so large it could have swallowed us whole if it had ever surfaced earlier. He admitted he had stayed in contact. Not often. He said, just enough. Enough to send money. Enough to check in. Enough to keep the truth alive while keeping me in the dark. He talked as if he were confessing a logistical problem, not a betrayal that rewrote the foundation of our marriage. He said he had always planned to tell me, one day, that the timing never felt right, that he didn't want to hurt me, that he was afraid of losing everything. Each excuse landed with a dull thud, meaningless against the weight of what he had done. The woman stood silently beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The young man, his son, stared at the floor, then at me, then back at the floor again. In his eyes, I saw confusion. Not guilt. He hadn't chosen the secret. He had simply been born into it. As my husband spoke, fragments of the past began rearranging themselves in my mind. Business trips that ran too long, phone calls taken outside, sudden absences explained away with tired smiles, moments I had questioned but ultimately dismissed because trust had always seemed safer than suspicion. By the time he finished speaking, the room was silent. No one applauded. No one cried. The truth sat between us, fully exposed at last. Not just the existence of another family, but the realization that my life, as I understood it, had been carefully edited for 3 decades. Everyone was watching me, waiting for the reaction they believed was inevitable. A scream, a collapse, a storm of questions hurled across the room. I could feel their expectations pressing in on me from every direction, heavy and suffocating. My husband's eyes searched my face, tense and hopeful at the same time, as if he were bracing for impact, yet still praying for mercy. But what they didn't understand was that the shock they had prepared for had already passed through me years ago. Quietly and without witnesses, I didn't react because this wasn't the first time doubt had knocked on my door. Long before this birthday, long before this public confession, there had been moments that didn't add up. The late nights that came with elaborate explanations, the phone he guarded too carefully, the way certain names were never mentioned, certain questions gently redirected. At the time, I had chosen trust, not because I was naive, but because I loved him and believed our marriage deserved the benefit of that choice. Still, doubt leaves fingerprints. Over time, I began to notice patterns, and instead of confronting him, instead of demanding answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear, I did something far quieter. I prepared myself. I gathered information. I paid attention. I listened more than I spoke. I learned that patience can be sharper than anger if you know how to use it. So when he stood there confessing, my mind wasn't racing. It was calm, painful, yes, but steady. The truth didn't explode inside me. It settled, and in that settling, I realized something important. Reacting emotionally would give him the chaos he expected, the distraction that might blur responsibility. Silence, on the other hand, would force him to face the full weight of what he had done without the comfort of my tears. I smiled not because I was unhurt, but because I was in control. A controlled response unsettles people more than rage ever could. My smile wasn't forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't acceptance. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the moment had finally arrived, the moment I had been preparing for without fully knowing its shape. In that room, surrounded by witnesses, I understood that my reaction was no longer about him. It was about me, about dignity, about choosing not to unravel in front of people who didn't deserve my vulnerability. I let him finish speaking. I let the silence stretch, and in that silence, I reclaimed something he had taken from me long ago, my sense of agency. They expected me to break. Instead, I stood whole, and that was the first sign that this story was not going to end the way anyone else in that room had predicted. The box had been sitting in the hallway for most of the afternoon, plain and unremarkable, tucked beside the coat rack where no one paid it any attention. It was small enough to be overlooked, ordinary enough to be mistaken for a forgotten gift or some household item waiting to be put away. No one asked about it. No one imagined it had anything to do with the moment unfolding in the living room. And that, in a way, was fitting. The most powerful truths are often hidden in the most ordinary containers. When I finally reached for it, the movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Every pair of eyes followed me as I lifted the box and carried it back into the room. My husband frowned, confusion flickering across his face. This wasn't part of his plan. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, for emotional collapse. Not for this calm, measured response, not for something that suggested I had known more than he believed. I placed the box on the table between us and slid it toward him without a word. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. For a moment, he didn't touch it. His hands hovered, uncertain, as if the cardboard itself might bite. When he finally opened the lid, his face drained of color. Inside were documents arranged neatly, carefully, the way I organize anything that matters. Copies of bank statements highlighting transfers he had explained away years ago. Printed emails, preserved and time-stamped. A timeline I had created. Mapping dates, absences, inconsistencies. Not accusations, just facts. There were legal papers too, folded precisely, prepared long before this day ever arrived. Proof not only of his secret life, but of my awareness, my patience, and my preparation. He began flipping through the papers frantically, his breath shallow, his confidence dissolving with every page. The story he had told himself, that he controlled the narrative, that I was discovering the truth for the first time, collapsed in front of everyone. This was no impulsive reaction. This was the result of years of quiet observation and careful planning. I didn't explain the contents of the box. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. More importantly, it spoke louder than any argument I could have made. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The secret he had carried for decades was no longer his alone, and the shock he intended to deliver had been returned, refined, and multiplied. As he closed the box with trembling hands, I realized that this wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. The box wasn't meant to hurt him. It was meant to end the illusion that I had been a passive participant in my own deception. The party didn't end with shouting or slammed doors. There was no dramatic exit, no scene that guests would later whisper about in hushed tones. Instead, it dissolved slowly, awkwardly, like a performance that had lost its script. People found excuses to leave. Coats were collected. Half-eaten cake was wrapped in napkins no one really wanted. The woman and her son stood quietly near the door, unsure of where they belonged now that the truth was no longer hidden. My husband remained seated, staring at the box in front of him as if it might suddenly explain how everything had gone so wrong. I thanked the guests for coming. The words came easily, almost automatically, surprising even me. Politeness, I realized, can be a form of armor. It allowed me to move through the room with dignity, while everyone else struggled with discomfort and disbelief. When the last car pulled away, the house felt strangely calm, emptied not just of people, but of pretense. That night, we didn't argue. There was nothing left to debate. The facts had been laid out, the illusions stripped away. My husband tried to speak, to apologize, to explain his fear and his regret, but his words felt weightless. Regret after 30 years sounds different. It arrives too late. Carrying the echo of all the time's honesty was a choice and not a necessity. I told him what I had already decided. Not in anger, not with tears, just plainly. I explained what would happen next, the steps that would be taken, the boundaries that would be enforced. He listened because, for the first time, he had no control over the direction of the conversation. The future he had assumed was secure was suddenly uncertain, and he could feel it slipping away. What no one at the party saw coming was that my ending wasn't destruction. It was release. The secret that had defined our marriage without my consent no longer had power over me. I wasn't leaving in shame or bitterness. I was leaving with clarity, with the knowledge that I had honored myself even when I was being deceived. As I went to bed that night, the house felt quieter than it ever had, but not lonely. Some silences are heavy, others are clean. This one was the latter. And in that quiet, I understood something profound. Smiles can be misread. Sometimes they are not signs of forgiveness, but signals of finality. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you see life a little differently, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life inspired stories about secrets, strength, and unexpected endings. New stories drop every week, and the next one might change the way you see everything.